The Gold Washers. Johnny did not return at all that night, but showed up next morning at the diggings, looking bleary-eyed and sleepy. He told us he had slept with a friend and replied rather curtly that he was a little behind the game. I believed myself that he was cleaned out, but that was none of our business. Every night we divided the dust into 5 parts. Don Gaspar and Vasquez got 2 of these. The remainder we again divided into 4. I took charge of Talbot's share. We carried the dust always with us, for the camp was no longer safe from thieves. In order to effect this division, we had to have some sort of scales. I went up to the single store to see what I could do. The storekeeper was a drawling, slow down east Yankee, perpetually chewing a long sliver or straw, talking exclusively through his nose, keen for a bargain, grasping of the last cent in a trade, and yet singularly interesting and agreeable. His sense of dry humor had a good deal to do with this. He had no gold scales to lend or to hire, but he had some to sell. The price was $15 for an ordinary pair of balances worth not over $1.50. And you will find that cheap if the miners keep coming in as fast as they do, said he. In 2 weeks they'll be worth $50. We bought them and obtained from them great satisfaction. Vasquez used to weigh his gold at night and again in the morning, in hopes, I suppose, that it had bred overnight. Certainly the storekeeper's statement as to the influx of miners was justified. They came every day in droves. We began to feel quite like old-timers, and looked with infinite scorn on these greenhorns. They were worse than we had been, for I have seen them trying to work in the moonlight. The diggings were actually getting crowded. It was no longer feasible to dig wherever we pleased to do so. We held many miners' meetings, adopting regulations. A claim was to be 15 feet square. Work must begin on it within 10 days, and so forth. Each of the 5 members of our party staked out 2 claims each, on which we worked in turn. All the old-timers respected these regulations, but some of the newcomers seemed inclined to dispute them, so that many meetings and much wrangling ensued. The truth of the matter was that none of us had the slightest permanent interest in the place. We intended merely to make our piles and to decamp. Each was for himself. Therefore, there was no solidarity. We regulated only when we were actually forced to it, so that with what we called private affairs, we declined to interfere. A man could commit any crime in the Decalogue if it so pleased him. His victims must protect themselves. Such things as horse stealing, grand larceny, claim jumping, and mining regulations we dealt with, but other things were not our affair. We were too busy and too slightly interested in what little public welfare a temporary mining camp might have. Even when in a few cases turbulence resulted in shooting, we rarely punished, although strangely enough, our innate Anglo-Saxon feelings for the formality of government always resulted in a Sunday inquest. We deliberated solemnly. The verdict was almost invariably justifiable self-defense, which was probably near enough, for most of these killings were the result of quarrels. Murders for the purpose of robbery, later so frequent, were as yet almost unknown. Twice, however, and in both instances, the prisoner was one of the gamblers. We pronounced judgment. One of these men was banished, the other hanged. All in all, a very fair semblance of order was kept, but I cannot help now but feel that our early shirking of responsibility, which was typical of all California, made necessary, later, great upheavals of popular justice. About this time also, the first of the overland wagon trains began to come through. Hangman's Gulch was not on the direct route, but some enterprising individual had found our trail fairly practical for wagons, and 10 miles shorter than the regular road. After that, many followed, and soon we had a well-cleared road. They showed plainly the hardships of a long journey, for the majority of them were thin, sick-looking, and discouraged. Few of them stopped at the diggings, although most had come west in hopes of gold, but pushed on down to the pastures of the Sacramento. They were about worn out and needed to recuperate before beginning anything new. Some were out of provisions and practically starved. The Yankee storekeeper sold food at terrible rates. I remember that quinine, a drug much in demand, cost $1 a grain. We used to look up from our diggings at the procession of these sad-faced, lean men walking by their emaciated cattle, and the women peering from the wagons, and be very thankful that we had decided against the much-touted overland route. One day, however, an outfit went through of quite a different character. We were apprised of its approach by a hunter named Bagsby. He loped down the trail to the river level, very much in a hurry. "Boys," he shouted, "quit work. Come see what's coming down the trail," with which he charged back again up the hill. His great excitement impressed us, for Bagsby, like most of the old-time Rocky Mountain men, was not ordinarily what one would call an emotional individual. Therefore, we dropped our tools and surged up the hill as fast as we could go. I think we suspected Indians. The train of 3 wagons drawn by strong oxen was lurching slowly down the road. It differed little from others of its kind, save that the cattle were in better shape, and the men walking alongside, of the tall, competent backwoodsman type, seemed well and hearty. But perhaps 100 yards ahead of the leading wagon came a horse, the only horse in the outfit, and on it, riding side saddle, was a girl. She was a very pretty, red-cheeked girl, and she must have stopped within half a mile or so of the camp in order to get herself up for this impressive entrance. Her dress was of blue calico, with a white yoke and heavy flounces or panniers. Around her neck was a black velvet ribbon. On her head was a big leghorn hat with red roses. She rode through the town, her head high, like a princess, and we all cheered her like mad. Not once did she look at us, but I could see her bosom heaving with excitement beneath her calico, and her nostrils wide. She was a remarkably pretty girl, and this was certainly the moment of her triumph. We fell into sanity as respects our hours of work and the way we went at it. Often we took as much as an hour and a half off at noon, or quit work early in the day. Then it was pleasant to sit with other miners under the trees or in the shade by the stream, swapping yarns, doing our mending or washing, and generally getting acquainted. As each man's product was his own, no one cared how much or how little the others worked. Simply, when he quit, his share ceased. This does not mean that we shirked our work. However, we merely grew to be a little sensible. Some of our discussions were amusing, and several of them most illuminating. Thus one day, John Semple summed up a long talk in which the conversation had swung wildly among the ideas of what each would do when he had dug enough gold. That led us to consider what amount we thought would be enough for each of us. John settled it. "Enough," he said, "is always a little more than a man has." The political situation was fruitful of much idle discussion also. California had not been formally placed on any footing whatever by the United States Congress. Whatever any community did in the way of legislation or regulation was extra-legal and subject to ratification. I have heard grave discussion as to whether even murder could be considered a crime, since in this no-man's land there was no real law forbidding it. A good many Chinese drifted in about this time and established a camp of their own a short distance downstream. We took some pride in them as curiosities, with their queer thatch-like hats their loose blue clothing, their pigtails wound tight around their heads, and their queer yellow faces. They were an unobtrusive people, scratching away patiently, though spasmodically, on the surface of the ground. We sometimes strolled down to see them. They were very hospitable and pleased at the interest they excited. We made from 14 to 17 ounces of gold dust a day for some weeks, working our 2 cradles something like 8 hours a day. With gold at the then current rate of $14 an ounce, this was a good return, and we were quite happy. Besides, we were always hoping for a big strike. One day, as I was in the very act of turning my shovelful of dirt into the cradle, my eye caught a dull gleam. I instantly deflected the motion to dump the dirt on the stones alongside, fished about, and dug out a nugget that weighed 3 3/4 ounces. This was by far the largest single nugget found in these diggings, for most of the gold here came in flakes, and it attracted much attention. It belonged to me individually because I had not yet dumped it into the cradle. About this time, we had to come to some sort of decision, for our provisions were about exhausted. We had no desire to replenish our stock from that of the local storekeeper. We were doing pretty well in the diggings, but we had also fairly healthy appetites, and I am convinced that at the prices the man charged, we should have no more than kept even. Williams, the storekeeper, was levying double profits, one from us and one from the overland immigrants. Don Gaspar proposed we send out Vasquez with all the horses to restock at Sutter's Fort. We were a trifle doubtful as to whether Vasquez would ever come back, but Don Gaspar seemed to have confidence in his man. Finally, though a little doubtfully, we came to the plan. Don Gaspar sent out also to McClellan for safekeeping his accumulations of gold dust, but we did not go quite that far. In view of probable high prices, we entrusted him with 18 ounces for the purchase of goods. While he was away, we came to another decision. It had been some weeks preparing. The diggings were becoming overcrowded. Almost every foot of the bar was occupied, and more men were coming in every day. No longer could the newcomer be sure of his color the afternoon of his arrival, but was forced to prospect here and there, up and down the river, until he found a patch of the pay dirt. Most trusted simply to luck, but some had systems on which they worked. I have seen divining rods used. The believers in chance seemed to do as well as anyone else. But also, our own yield was decreasing. The last week we had gained only 19 ounces all told. This might be merely a lean bit of misfortune, or it might mean that we had taken the best from our 10 claims. Since the human mind is prone to changes, we inclined to the latter theory. We were getting restless. No miner ever came to California who did not believe firmly that he would have done much better had he come out one voyage earlier, and no miner ever found digging so rich that he had not a sneaking suspicion that he could do even better a little further on. Our restlessness was further increased by the fact that we were now seeing a good deal of Sam Bagsby, the hunter. He and Yank had found much in common, and foregathered of evenings before our campfire. Bagsby was a man over 50, tall and straight as a youngster, with a short white beard, a gray eye, and hard tanned flesh. He was a typical Rocky Mountain man, wearing, even in the hottest weather, his fur cap with the tail hanging behind, his deerskin moccasins, and his fringed buckskin hunting shirt. Mining possessed no interest for him whatever. He was by profession a trapper, and he had crossed the plains a half a dozen times. No mining for me, he stated emphatically. I paddled around after the stuff for a while, till my hands swelled up like poison, and my back creaked like a frozen pine tree in the wind. Then I quit, and I stayed quit. I'm a hunter, and I'm making a good living, because I ain't very particular on how I live." He and Yank smoked interminable pipes and swapped yarns. Johnny and I, like nothing better, tend to keep quiet and listen to them. Bagsby had come out with Captain Sutter and told of that doughty soldier's early skirmishes with the Indians. His tale of the mountains, the plains, and the game and Indians were so much romance to us, and we both wished heartily that fate could have allowed us a chance at such adventures. "But why don't you fellows branch out?" Bagsby always ended. "What do you want to stick here for like a lot of groundhogs? There's rivers back in the hills a heap better than this one, and nobody there. You'd have the place plumb to yourselves. Get in where the mountains is really mountainous." Then he would detail at length and slowly his account of the great mountains, deep canyons, the shadows of forests, ridges high up above the world, and gorges far within the bowels of the earth through which dashed white torrents. We gathered and pieced together ideas of great ice and snow mountains, and sun-warmed bars below them, and bear and deer, and a high clear air breathing through a vast, beautiful, and solitary wilderness. The picture itself was enough to set bounding the pulses of any young man, with a drop of adventure in his veins. But also, Bagsby was convinced that there we should find richer diggings than any yet discovered. It stands to reason, he argued, that the farther up you get, the more gold there is. All this loose stuff here is just what's washed down from the main supply. If you boys really want rich diggings, then you want to push up into the Porcupine River country. But with its glowing and vivid impression, we gathered another, that of a trackless wilderness, fearful abysses down which to find a way, labyrinthian defiles, great forests. None of us knew how to cope with these things. Yank, the best woodsman of us all, had no experience in the mountains. None of us knew anything of Indian warfare. None of us had the least idea that we could find Porcupine River, even if we were to be given accurate directions on how to get there. Nevertheless, the idea with us had been growing. Some of the bolder spirits among our acquaintances used to talk it over with us at odd times. McNally, Buck Berry, and his partner, Missouri Jones. We did not discuss it as a plan, hardly as a possibility, merely as a pleasant theme. We found and advanced any amount of objections. The uncertainty of finding any gold at all, the expense of such a journey, the danger from Indians, the fact that we could find other proved diggings much nearer, and 100 others. The moment one of us had advanced one of these objections, he was at once himself the most eager to demolish it. Thus, we gradually worked ourselves toward enthusiasm. If Sam Bagsby would join us, it might be worth trying, we came to at last. But Sam Bagsby scouted any such idea. "I ain't that kind of tomfool," said he. "If I want to paddle my hands blue, I'll do it here. I couldn't make more of a living anyway. I'll tell you, I ain't got no use for your prairie dog grubbing." Then McNally had an inspiration. "Will you go, Sam, if we pay you for going?" he asked. "Sure," replied the trapper at once. "I'm a laboring man. I'll go anywhere I'm paid to go." It came out that Bagsby's ideas of proper compensation were his supplies, $15 a week in gold, and a drink of whiskey twice a day. In all this gold country, he was the only man I met who genuinely despised money. I really think we hurried to our decision by this unexpected reasonableness on his part. At any rate, we decided definitely to go.